You've joined the Northridge 30 years, Northridge Earthquake 30 years later webinar series that a number of organizations have been working together this year. This is the 7th of our webinars this year. So we have the the American Society of Civil Engineers, Infrastructure Resilience Division, the ASCE Los Angeles section, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute SoCal chapter, Structural Engineers Association of Southern California, and Earthquake Country Alliance, just led by the Statewide California Earthquake Center, working together to bring you this webinar series this year. And I recognize many of you who've joined us for each of our webinars. Each of them you can find at the earthquakecountry.org/Northridge webpage and the calendar of events. You can see here they all have a very similar web address. The topics we've had have really spanned many, like full spectrum of topics related to the earthquake and its implications and what it's led to over the years. The most recent was on healthcare and the requirements for improving hospitals and other facilities in California because of the Northridge earthquake. And I'd like to turn over to our moderator for today's webinar, Ann Wine, with the U.S. Geological Survey, to introduce our presenters. And we're not hearing you. Not muted, but we're not hearing you. You know how to change your audio.
Hello?
Now we hear you.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much for letting me organize this webinar. We've had a lot of fun, the three of us, putting it together. So today we present lessons learned about business losses and economic recovery after the Northridge earthquake as a catalyst for research and application. Our speakers are Kathleen Turney and Cynthia Kroll. I will provide brief introductions, so please see their bios to appreciate their outstanding careers. So to begin, after the Northridge earthquake, Kathleen Turney, as a sociologist, broke ground on understanding the outcomes for firms and organizations. Kathleen has helped us look beyond the performance of engineered structures into the social roots of risk, the title of one of her books. Today, she is Professor Emerita at University of Colorado Boulder after directing the Natural Hazard Center for 14 years. And thanks for that. So over to you, Kathleen.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. Can you see my slide?
Yes, you could go into presentation mode. It would it would look better.
Oh, right.
The bottom right kind of your window, there's a little icon there next to the slider. There.
Yeah. Bear with me.
Take your time. There you go. Perfect. Looks great.
Again, thanks everybody for being with us today. Just to provide a little bit of background on the research that I was involved in on businesses and disasters. In the social sciences, really, there was very little known prior to the 1990s about how businesses fare in the aftermath of disasters. Most of the work that had been done up until then had focused on household impacts and recovery, or at the community level, community impacts and recovery or reconstruction, without really looking at that meso level of the individual organization. And in the field of economics, economists were mostly interested in looking at how disasters affected regional economies or even national economies, as opposed to looking at the firm level. We also knew that that it was likely that there were a variety of factors that would be influencing how businesses coped with disasters. That it wasn't going to be a very simple story to tell, that it was probably going to be a multivariate story to tell. And with that in mind, we thought what was needed were large-scale surveys involving large representative samples of businesses in order to be able to tease out the various impacts and the various factors that affected business recovery. Beginning in the early 1990s, when I was working at the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware, alongside former EERI President Joanne Nigg and our students, we began looking at businesses. And the first study that we did was to look at a large sample, representative sample of businesses in Des Moines, Iowa, that were affected by the 1993 Midwest floods. We also conducted some research looking at SBA loan decision-making involving businesses after the Whittier Narrows earthquake of 1987. So we were looking at the factors that influenced who got loans, how much money they got, and so forth. Subsequently, then we looked at the 1994 Northridge earthquake, which I'll be talking about today. We also did research on business vulnerability and preparedness in Memphis, and then later looked at long-term disaster recovery in Santa Cruz after Loma Prieta and South Dade County, which was affected by Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And all of these studies involved large stratified random samples of businesses, again, using Dun & Bradstreet data. Looking at what we did in Northridge, this was a mail survey of businesses in Los Angeles and Santa Monica. And it was stratified, the sample was stratified by MMI intensity, by business size, that is large and small businesses, and by sector. And we looked at 5 different sectors: wholesale and retail sales, services, manufacturing and construction, finance, insurance, and real estate, and other businesses that didn't fall into either of those other 4 categories. We did an initial sample of about 4,000 businesses, and we got about 1,000 responses for a response rate of about 25%. We looked at the literature on organizations and what we knew about what makes for good outcomes and not so good outcomes for businesses. That is, looking at the literature in that field of organizations. And with that sort of background in mind, we wanted to collect data on owner characteristics, such as the race and gender of business owners, business characteristics, such as size, age, renting versus owning the business property, and so on. Again, we were influenced there a lot by research on topics such as the liability of newness, the liability of smallness, that some organizations are just more vulnerable than others during normal times, and we thought probably during disasters as well. We ask a variety of questions about pre-disaster preparedness, as well as pre-disaster financial condition. Then, focusing on the disaster itself, we were interested in getting information on damage to the structure housing the business, to inventory and contents. We asked about lifeline service disruption, electrical power, water, telephone, so forth. We asked about any operational problems that businesses may have experienced in the aftermath of the earthquake, such as problems with customers getting to the business, problems with employees showing up for work, problems that the business proprietor might have had, for example, damage at their own home, and other kinds of operational problems. We asked about post-disaster aid access, and we asked about recovery outcomes. Now, this survey was conducted approximately 18 months after the earthquake. So we were asking businesses about whether they judge themselves to be worse off, better off, or about the same at that 18-month mark. What did we find? Well, we found a lot of things, and I'm just going to highlight just a few sort of high-level findings. Certainly, we found out that business and owner characteristics did matter. For example, older businesses that had been around a longer time tended to fare better. Those businesses that were minority owned tended to not fare so well. Size definitely mattered in this case, with larger businesses reporting better recovery outcomes. Sector was also important, with businesses, particularly in the sales and the service sectors, not doing as well as those in the other sectors. For example, manufacturing and construction, which those businesses tended to be doing better. Now, I think it's important to note here that these businesses in the retail and the service, wholesale retail service sectors tend to experience a lot of churn during normal times. That is, there are higher rates of entering into this sector and also leaving. So these businesses maybe could be thought of as more vulnerable during normal times, and that vulnerability carried over into the post-earthquake setting. The more operational challenges that business owners reported, those things having to do with things like transportation system disruption, customers not coming back, these tended to be associated with poorer recovery outcomes. Infrastructure damage and disruption, again, very important. And here in particular, it seemed that electrical power disruption and the duration of disruption were associated with poorer outcomes reported even 18 months after the earthquake. Also, local damage around where the business was located was also associated with poorer outcomes 18 months out. And that was independent of the impacts that were experienced at the business itself. So what we reasoned here is that, if you think about it, an individual business exists within an ecology of other businesses. And people patronize businesses based often on their adjacency to other ones. For example, if I want to go to my bank, I go to the bank and it's likely that I will go to the grocery store that's near the bank or to the dry cleaners that's near the bank. So this factor of local disruption, even if you didn't experience damage yourself, comes into play in that respect. Similarly, if there's a lot of residential damage around the business, that too comes into play, because if people are relocated, they're not around to patronize the business, that will affect the recovery outcomes. We also looked at what didn't seem to matter. And there it was interesting. We like to think that businesses that engage in preparedness activities are more likely to be able to weather a disaster. We did not find this. And we thought that there were a number of reasons for that. First of all, first and foremost, businesses had done very, very little to prepare. We asked about 16 different preparedness measures that they may have adopted. And what we found in Northridge was the average number of measures that were adopted was about 3.9 measures. So they really hadn't done all that much to begin with in terms of preparedness. We also found that, one important thing that businesses might want to do is to plan for relocation if they experience damage. But a very tiny proportion of the businesses engaged in that kind of planning. They just didn't do that, right? They did like the typical things that were less expensive to do, like having a first aid kit at the business or doing a little bit of training with employees, as opposed to relocation planning, as opposed to having business interruption insurance, for example. These were just a very, very tiny proportion of the businesses had engaged in those kinds of activities. And I think even more salient here is that what really affected businesses were offsite impacts that didn't have anything to do with preparedness at the business site. I talked about, electrical power disruption. I talked about transportation system disruption. These were things that were, by and large, not within the power of the business owners to engage in to begin with. So it was a lot of the offsite impacts that really affected the businesses in terms of their capacity to cope. So very little preparedness to begin with, not preparing for the kinds of things that ultimately disrupted those businesses. And similarly, we thought, well, if businesses were able to access a lot of post-disaster aid, they should be better off. Aid should go a long way to making these businesses whole again. So we reasoned that the more aid that was accessed, the better the outcomes would be. That was not the case. And we reasoned that what was really going on there was that, first of all, the kind of businesses that were applying for a lot of aid were the businesses that really had high losses to begin with. Also, the aid that was available often came in the form of small business administration loans, which actually added to the business's debt. These were not outright grants. These were loans that would need to be paid back. So there was an additional debt burden for those businesses that tried to access the SBA loans. And now, with a lot of subsequent research that's been going on, we know that post-event aid, whether we're talking about households or whether we're talking about businesses, does not, in fact, make businesses whole again. The aid that's out there is really insufficient. And again, there was very little utilization of insurance, and very few businesses had business interruption insurance, or if they did, they weren't able to utilize it. There are some caveats, some limitations that I want to mention about the research that we did in Northridge. First of all, the study focused on business survivors. That is, we tapped businesses that had existed before the Northridge earthquake and that still existed 18 months later. So somebody could say, well, you don't know about the businesses that didn't survive, that went out of business. But we do know that the vast majority of businesses do survive after earthquakes and other disasters. Business owners don't give up their businesses so easily. More recent research, particularly research on outcomes following Hurricane Katrina has done a better job of following businesses that moved out of the impact area or that went out of business. And so again, we're learning a lot more about the factors that are associated with business outcomes and with business demise. Also, the landscape was a little bit different in 1994. Northridge really occurred at the dawn of the internet era when, not a lot of businesses were doing everything online, or even the majority of their sales and their activities online. And we need to ask ourselves then, well, this is, we're in a different situation now. How about businesses currently that are entirely or partly online? Does this help them be better able to cope because they can reach out to a broader segment of customers? Does this kind of thing make a difference now that so much commerce is being done online? Would we find different outcomes? So just to wrap up, I want to mention, I think, some of the ways that the Northridge study was really a catalyst. The work that we and others did in Northridge inspired a lot of publications and really started a new line of social science disaster research, looking at private firms, something that very little was known about before. And this is a burgeoning area, not only in the United States, but around the world. We're going to hear next, when Cynthia does her presentation, about how the findings from the firm level research that we did were incorporated into macroeconomic analyses, impact and loss assessments, and scenarios like HayWired. And more recently, the work that was done following Northridge was incorporated into a publication on the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic through 2 work groups at the Converge facility at the University of Colorado Boulder Natural Hazard Center. And you'll see there, listed there, a bunch of names that I know are familiar to you, like Stephanie Chang and Anne Wine herself, and Adam Rose, and others. So this was a new publication by the Converge COVID-19 working groups for public health and social science research. So that's the end of my presentation, and I guess we'll transition now to Cynthia.
Yes, thank you so much, Kathleen. And also for setting up Cynthia. So Cynthia complements the sociology with her expertise as a regional economist. So while chief economist for the Association of Bay Area Government and Metropolitan Transportation Commission, she updated and expanded the economic forecast for the region. And in turn, she used this model to evaluate economic impacts of the HayWired scenario. So thanks for that, Cynthia. And since then, Cynthia has co-chaired the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Learning from Earthquakes Business Resilience Working Group from 2019 to 2023. So Cynthia, over to you.
I realized I had not unmuted myself, so I was getting all ready, shared my screen and all that, but huh. All right, there we go. Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, Anne, and Kathleen. Thank you so much for giving that very interesting talk on Northridge. I'm really impressed with how relevant and timely the work that had been done right after Northridge still seems today. And it certainly contributes to what we've done since then. So the work I'm going to talk about is not just my work at all. Anne was very involved, but also many others from many institutions, and I'm just not able to give them all credit here today, unfortunately, but it was really a large team, several teams, depending what we were working on, that was involved in this work. So here are a few seminal studies that laid the groundwork for the efforts I've been involved in. I won't go through the details of this slide, but the Northridge work is among several studies that helped shape the later work I'll talk about. So the Loma Prieta column and the Northridge column are examples of studies that identified key concerns, as well as the shape of the kinds of responses needed. And then the last column introduces the concept of scenarios, which are prospective studies, what might happen, but based on retrospective work. Here's a quick diagram summarizing the streams of research following Northridge that I've been involved in that have contributed to our understanding of economic and business impacts of earthquakes. I'll be talking about the HayWired scenario and then a series of studies that the EERI, Learning from Earthquakes Business Resilience Working Group, has engaged in. So I'm going to begin with HayWired. The HayWired name in part shows a commitment to understanding impacts of a large earthquake on wired and wireless information and communications technology and services. So again, the modern era versus what happened in Northridge. More broadly, the concept of wired captures the connections among risks in space and time, cascading and compounding hazards. The work was multi-year and multidisciplinary, starting with the earth science of the earthquake itself, building on this, the understanding of engineering impacts, and then followed by, in this case, an intensive analysis of social and economic consequences. So several chapters reported the assessments of what the economic consequences might be. The first chapter is a summary, but the other four are the ones that I will go through. And each of those chapters really built on the work that Northridge had done. And here are some specific items that became then involved in or incorporated into these studies. So water service interruption was addressed in both of the macro analyses. The first two chapters I'll talk about. Challenges to businesses in an undamaged building, including non-structural losses, disruption of utilities, transportation services, loss of customers and of employees, came into play in several chapters. For example, the transportation disruption is addressed in both macro studies and in the spatial analysis. The business characteristics defined in Northridge were also used in the microanalysis of building damage, which was built on a similar data set. So let's look briefly at some of the HayWired scenario results. I have a slide for each chapter. You can imagine that it is a pretty high-level summary. The first macro chapter shows the overall output losses over 6 months for California as a whole, 4%, and for the Bay Area, about 8%. However, the report highlights resilience factors, which can cut the losses down, those shown on the left-hand side of this slide, by close to half. Resilience in economic speak means taking into account substitution effects, using different supplies, for example, flexibility in terms of timing of production, and also segmentation of activities, not doing them all in the same place, perhaps. The highest losses in HayWired would be in Alameda County, estimated to have a 24% output loss in the first 6 months without resilience, but brought down to about 14% if resilience measures were used by business. Next study, Alameda, the Association of Bay Area Governments had built a 20-year regional forecast using a regional model, which is designed for impact analysis and sensitivity testing And I was in charge of that work, and how could I resist putting the HayWired earthquake into this model? So we used the model to assess how the earthquake could affect the economic forecast. The analysis starts using hazardous data on what the impact of building damage would be on employment. And that gets put into the model and then gives us our HayWired primary estimate. The model shows the effects are drawn out over several years, but with a lot of the recovery happening within the first year or two. And that's how these models are designed, to have a quick return to trend. Within 7 years, the region would regain not only the employment level it had previous to the disaster, but would return to projected levels of growth. We then extended the analysis to take into account the effects of other types of damage and disruption. In the chart on the right, you see a comparison of building damage and transportation disruption effects. The analysis highlights the interconnectedness of the region. So at the epicenter in the East Bay, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties, the largest impacts come from building damage. There are substantial losses in other parts of the Bay Area due to damage to transportation infrastructure, BART, roadways, bridges. The analysis required a lot of judgment calls, taking into account that there were redundant systems, as well as the possibility of telecommuting. Coming back to the chart on the left, we also did sensitivity tests to see what could derail this somewhat optimistic view of recovery. It was very sensitive to the availability and cost of construction workers, and if there were bottlenecks getting those workers, losses could take much longer to recover from, perhaps 10 years. We also considered possibly lower or higher telecommuting levels, as well as longer-term impacts on the tech sector. If companies decide to relocate or change growth plans, this could lead to a lower rate of long-term growth in the region, which may be what we're actually seeing now in the Bay Area. Next study, the aggregate numbers don't fully explain business vulnerabilities. So this study looks at categories similar to the Northridge study and connects business location at the time of earthquake to shaking levels and building damage, identifying vulnerable sectors and ownership types, and it does that by looking at individual businesses and the buildings they're in. The analysis, so it's also done in Bradstreet data originally, although it's in the NETS data set, which is a time series of that. It identifies types of businesses located in geographies with high levels of damage and in building types particularly prone to damage. On average, based on establishment data used, 7.6% of the region's jobs are located in areas at high risk from building damage or fire. Not surprisingly, the highest risk county is Alameda, followed by Contra Costa. The sectors that were found to be at risk, most at risk, were, for the most part, not that different from what was found in the Northridge study. In the East Bay, there are high levels of minority-owned, branch, and low-revenue businesses relative to the region as a whole, and that left them looking more vulnerable as well. And then the last study I'll talk about was a spatial analysis that zeroes in on the areas of concentrated damage, defined by high shaking damage, fire damage, or both. Those are shown in tan and brown on the map. On the left, we tie this geographic identification to travel data that's reported by larger sub-areas, which are outlined with black lines on the map. We examine flows between the sub-areas that either have a lot of concentrated damage or have less damage, and the illustration on the right shows those interactions. About 90,000 employees live and work in the sub-areas that were deemed to have concentrated damage. An additional 180,000 worked in those areas but don't live there. And in addition, almost 250,000 employees who were working in less damaged areas lived in the sub areas of concentrated damage, and those employees might not be coming back to work for a while. In all, 15% of employees either lived or worked in areas of concentrated damage in this analysis, twice the share estimated by the building damage estimates alone in the previous chapter I talked about. So what do we get out of a scenario like HayWired? It highlights the wide range of damage types that may impact businesses. It shows the interconnectedness of different types of damage in different locations, business losses, housing losses, many types of networks that serve them. It illustrates geographic differences. So what looked like a catastrophe for Alameda County, for the region as a whole, was a shorter term concern. It also expands on the idea of recovery to raise the possibility of long-term change to individual businesses, neighborhoods, to sectors, or even to the region as a whole. And it brings out the role of resilience, redundancy, and flexibility in mitigating impacts. By bringing in the experience from other types of disasters, it can also inform policy options. But a scenario is fixed in one set of places, one earthquake, one point in time. So how does continuing research on business experiences and earthquakes improve preparation and response capabilities? Moving from scenarios to research on events, I'm going to focus on the work that EERI Business Resilience Working Group has been doing in the past decade. This group was established following the Napa earthquake in 2014 to bring engineers and social scientists together to understand which of the consequences of an earthquake are most damaging to businesses and what is needed in terms of building or other actions to help them recover. The group decided to build a survey tool to connect damage to buildings and surrounding areas to business impacts and recovery. The initial plan was that the survey could be administered sequentially over time to understand immediate versus long-term effects. The group developed a fairly long set of questions that could be applied post-quake, available to academics, government agencies, and community groups. The survey process was tested in 3 pilot studies. We learned a lot from the pilot studies. First, these were not major earthquakes. The damage was quite contained to a few locations, a small number of examples of businesses that did have major damage. Nevertheless, we found that conducting surveys as compared to building surveillance could be quite disruptive and intrusive to the business. Yet the one case where we surveyed 2 years later brought out that many of the details we were seeking had been forgotten or conflated with what had happened since. And I'd be interested in talking to Kathleen more about how 18 months worked in terms of the time period in which they did their survey. The length needed to fully answer the engineer and social scientist research needs was daunting to respondents who much preferred to tell their story anecdotally rather than answering structured questions. An open-ended discussion around the experience brought out new impacts and policy ideas that hadn't been thought of in designing the survey. The last pilot survey was in 2018, and the survey instrument still exists and is available. But after that, the working group approach changed. We expanded our participants with more academics, representatives from several federal agencies that do this kind of assessment after an earthquake, a representative from New Zealand, as well as continuing participation of the engineers and EERI personnel. There were mainly small earthquakes in the U.S. during this whole period, but some very damaging earthquakes outside the U.S. And we were asked to collaborate with EERI's virtual reconnaissance group to identify economic and business concerns in other parts of the world as well. We also became more interested in expanding the research approach to add observation, informal discussions, interviews, and focus groups to our methodology. We shared our resources with the group studying impacts of an earthquake in Oaxaca, and more recently, we began a more extensive collaboration with a university professor and a business organization in Turkey. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit because it used all of those tools. After virtual reconnaissance and a few informal conversations, we applied all these extended approaches, as well as a separate labor market survey in partnership with Dr. Ezgi Orhan of Çankaya University and the GGK Gaziantep Entrepreneurial Businesswomen Association. And a sampling of those findings follows. Dr. Orhan conducted the survey and also roundtable discussions, all among the members of this business organization. It was organized around the 1-year anniversary of the earthquake, perhaps the sweet spot for many where the pain was still fresh, but they were rebuilding and not an immediate recovery. All businesses experienced some closure, and more than half were closed for longer than a month. Both the survey and the roundtable respondents emphasized that it wasn't the building damage that was their primary problem. Sound familiar? Physically, the impacts on utilities and transportation were the much greater problem. Even more important were the lack of customers and of employees who, for many reasons, could not work. A lot of dissatisfaction came out in the discussion with how structural evaluations were handled. Businesses often waited weeks for inspections to certify buildings that were safe to occupy. Financial problems outweighed everything but lack of customers in the survey responses on recovery, and were at the top of the roundtable discussion. From paying employees out of their own savings, even if the employees couldn't work and no income came in, to the lack of assistance or debt forgiveness from government or banks, and delays in insurance payments. The link with housing came through as well in the roundtables, with the business owners or managers offering everything from company cars as living space to factory space, hotel space, or a place in second homes to their employees and their families to help them survive and get back to work. Not shown here were also responses on preparedness. 40% reported taking some preparedness actions before the earthquake, but even these, when asked in the roundtables, did not feel prepared, nor did most know what would really help, even if they were doing more to prepare now. Very few had business interruption insurance, and only 20% had property insurance. Post-quake, the things they felt really would help were having savings and having a reserve there, making sure their employees were well prepared, but also being able to retrain new employees after the event, as well as backup supplies and redundancy. So the Turkey studies used mixed quantitative and qualitative methods to learn about business resilience from earthquakes. The roundtable discussions enriched the survey results and brought to light additional types of information. Collaboration with local researchers and the organization made it possible to accomplish this work, and some reciprocity ensued as the academics and GECAD contributed to local recovery capability, both in terms of their individual actions, but also through implementing and analyzing a survey of women employees in the container city. The focus on women entrepreneurs also raised some other questions about gender differences after disasters. For example, whether women entrepreneurs are they particularly inclined to going to great lengths to help employees and neighbors? The women's organization was also an example of a pre-existing organization that provided support for these women so that they had some resilience and resources for recovery after the earthquake. So this is a field of research where there are always new questions and the need for more information. Some key areas in the future center around functional recovery and around equity, leading to questions under the first bullet: what factors determine whether and how a business recovers, and what does advanced preparation mean, especially for smaller, less well-resourced organizations that don't have the capacity to take many preparatory steps. Earthquakes are by nature likely to create unexpected results. Are the right organizations being brought into the conversation beforehand so they can respond as needed after an event, and so that resources of different organizations can produce cumulative rather than duplicative action? We need to incorporate lessons not only from earthquake research, but also from the many other disaster experiences to improve our capacity to prepare and respond. So thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you to Kathleen and Anne for raising all this timely information. And I also want to thank here the members of the Business Resilience Working Group who helped build the capacity of this organization to study these topics. And I want to mention that our working group members come from the EERI community, but also from well beyond that. We welcome new committee members to move us forward on the tasks listed on the slide and to offer new ideas and to share in our response to any future events. So if you're interested, there's contact information at the bottom of the slide, and please get in touch with us and let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you both. So we'll go quickly into Q&A since time is racing by. And hello, Tinga. Thank you very much for your question. I'm going to pose it to both Kathleen and Cynthia. Do you think firm behaviours, e.g. preparedness, post-disaster recovery measures, have changed in the past 30 years, given the increasing frequency and intensity of disasters seen in recent years?
I'll take a first crack at that. I think at the large firm level, large firms are much more aware of this. I think if nothing else, they're forced by their insurers to be aware of it, and that they have taken many steps to be prepared. I think smaller firms, I would be more skeptical as to whether they're doing that much more, particularly the smallest businesses where just day-to-day survival is a lot of work. But Kathleen may have a broader picture on that.
Yes, I would definitely echo that. And we need to keep in mind that most businesses that are out there are small businesses. You know, in our Northridge sample, for example, the average number of employees was about 6. And there are lots of businesses that are just 1 or 2 person businesses. These are businesses that are operating on very tight margins on a day-to-day basis and don't have the resources or the bandwidth to really think about preparedness and to actually enact those measures. Also, what we found in Northridge were that looking at the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, for example, they tended to be better prepared and to have better outcomes. But this is a sector that's also highly regulated. They have to do certain things to prepare for disruption. So I think, you know, a question here is just as your question suggested, with so many disasters happening, communities experiencing repeated disasters, what can be done to ensure that businesses become more resilient?
Yeah. Thanks, Kathleen. There's an interesting NIST study led by Jennifer Helgeson around the pandemic that's starting to look at how proposing a framework for how businesses evolve over time through the different effects of disasters, through learning and adaptation and flexibility. So I think it's definitely a good new and important direction. Is anyone else want to pose a question, Mark, or shall I carry on? All right. So if the Northridge or similar earthquake happens again, how might the economic effects be different? So I guess Kathleen set that up with the observation that the internet was in its young days, and Cynthia has kind of explored it more recently in HayWired. So what thoughts do you have on that?
Well,
Cynthia?
go ahead, Kathleen.
Well, one thing that is now entirely different is remote work. And it would be really interesting to see what kinds of dynamics and what kinds of outcomes would be expected when people are distributed geographically, sometimes great distances from each other. How does that affect, for example, people's ability to coordinate within an organization? It's something that I don't think we know all that much about right now. You know, we used to think of you know, of a business, I guess we still do in many ways, as taking place or being active at a specific location. That's no longer the case.
Yeah, I think all those points are really important. You know, the dollar value this is a much denser area now. The dollar value might be higher of damage, but not necessarily the percentage value, because the proportion of newer buildings may be higher. I would hope that the loss in housing stock would be less, because so many soft story buildings were then basically taken off the market and were rebuilt better. But I'm not sure of that. I don't know how successful Los Angeles County has been in replacing soft story buildings. Again, I think a lot of transportation disruption really depends on what happens to the services. There's more redundancy in the LA area than there was, and a number of the most vulnerable systems have already gone down and been rebuilt. So one would hope that would help as well. And I agree entirely that being able to do some types of businesses online is really was a lifesaver in COVID and could well play a role here. Of course, all of this depends on how quickly you can get those services up and running. And that was something that's come out in each of these studies, that if you can get the power, the water, the transportation services back online again, then recovery can really happen for most of the area.
With the studies that we did on long-term recovery from Loma Prieta and Andrew, in those surveys, we began to ask the business owners about their customer base. Was it mainly local? Was it local and outside the local area? You know, what proportion of the customer base wasn't in the, you know, in the impact area itself? Because we were starting to get the sense that that sort of thing, the customer base, was going to be important. And I think it's increasingly important now with e-commerce just, you know, so dominant.
Very nice. I just want to call out that Lucy has chimed in to about the mandatory retrofit of soft first story affecting 20,000 buildings. So that will improve the resiliency of housing. So that's a plus for another Northridge earthquake.
And I've also
Yeah.
upped the ability, if anybody would like to raise their hand, you'll be able to come on and ask any questions by voice. We'll see you if anybody wants to do that, or you can also continue to put questions in the Q&A or chat. Any final questions?
Yes, and if there are none, I will ask another one.
Go ahead.
Okay. What would you like to see? How would you like to see the research and knowledge used about business impacts and advancing planning for business and economic disruption in our new world of compound and cascading hazards, and earthquakes, of course?
Well, you know, I think, you know, the state of California, for example, has a lot of resources available to businesses if they only reach them and look at them, that really can help walk you through preparedness. But there are things like supply chains that can be very problematic, and I don't know that those resources really walk you through identifying your alternatives of supply chains under different types of conditions. But I think that could be really useful. Trying to think what other, and then of course, getting businesses to think in advance about alternative locations and what the safety is of the location they're in now, and what's their ability to find temporary quarters if this space is down for some reason. And that varies so much by different types of businesses. It's challenging, but just raising the question can help them become better able to respond to this. Actually, my first foray into research on earthquakes was in the early 1970s, and it was at SRI, and it was an assessment of a technology assessment of earthquake prediction. And I was in charge of looking at the sociological work that had been done that would inform us on this. And the thing that I still remember, I don't want to tell you how many decades later, is that in places where, and for individuals who had thought about the problem and come up with some ideas of what they might do, they were much more resilient than places or people who had just been hit by it and never thought it would have happened. So I think that there's a lot to be gained just from getting businesses to think about this.
I want to echo what you just said, Cynthia, about supply chains and about the importance of redundancy in supply chains. Boy, COVID gave us a lesson in that we'll never forget. Just this last week, I heard a story on the news about the fact that the company that makes 60% of all the IV fluid that we use in our hospitals was knocked out by Hurricane Helene. And it was a story about how hospitals and other healthcare providers are being forced now to improvise because they simply don't have the IV fluid that they were used to getting because of this one company in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Mark, I think you need to take over, right? What happened to Mark?
I'm here. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everybody, for the fantastic webinar today. And just to share about our next webinar in the series, episode 8, Rethinking Communication about Seismic Risk, Linking Knowledge to Action in Innovative Ways Since the 1994 Northridge Earthquake, which will be moderated by Louise Comfort. And the presenters and speakers will be Ron Iguchi, from ImageCat. It's done a lot of remote sensing and ways of communicating information about risk. And of course, Dr. Lucy Jones, who has been working in this area for so many years. And so it's going to be a fantastic webinar. It's going to be on Wednesday, December 18th. And the link to this has been put into the chat. I'll just put it again right now. So it's right there, the bottom of the chat window. And all of these are webinars up to today. The recording are online, so you can watch the past webinars as well at our event listing, which I'll put in the chat too. And thank you all for joining. And we hope you can go ahead and register for that episode 8 right now, or there will be email reminders coming out as well. And here's a list of all of our events for the year that you can see the past webinars. Thank you, Anne, Kathleen, and Cynthia for your presentations today. And everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.